Close your eyes for a moment. Picture the medieval world. What do you see? Perhaps shining armour, grand castles, or bustling marketplaces. But behind this familiar facade existed a different reality, a world populated by individuals who didn't quite belong. We're embarking on a journey to uncover the hidden lives of medieval outcasts and misfits, people branded by disease, ostracized for their beliefs, or simply born into circumstances that condemned them to the margins of society. What was it like to live on the edges of a world so firmly rooted in tradition and hierarchy? Tonight, we delve into the hidden lives of medieval outcasts and misfits. From lepers and beggars to wandering scholars and accused heretics, we'll explore the diverse and often challenging experiences of those who lived on the periphery of medieval society. Their lives, though often difficult, offer a fascinating glimpse into the complexities of this era and reveal a side of history we rarely see. Join us as we explore their stories, seeking to understand the challenges they faced and the unique perspectives they offer on the medieval experience. Tonight, we listen to the untold stories, to the voices from the fringes of history, and enter an earlier time together. Take, for example, the case of the Beguines. These were women, often from lower social strata, who chose to live a life of religious devotion outside the traditional structures of the convent. They weren't nuns bound by strict vows and cloistered away. Instead, they lived in communities, supporting themselves through various forms of labour, weaving, nursing, or even teaching. Now, the church viewed them with suspicion. Their independence, their lack of formal vows, challenged the established order. They were accused of heresy, of licentiousness, of generally upsetting the delicate balance of power. Yet, despite the risks, they persisted. They carved out a space for themselves, a space where they could express their faith and exercise a degree of autonomy unheard of for most women of their time. Figures like Marguerite Porret, a Beguine burned at the stake for heresy, embody this complex picture. She refused to recant her beliefs, even in the face of death, demonstrating a fierce commitment to her own interpretation of religious truth. This wasn't passive victimhood, it was a deliberate act of defiance, a staking of claim to her own spiritual authority. And then there are the wandering scholars, or vagantes. These were students, often impoverished and without a clear path to a stable career, who roamed from university to university, seeking knowledge and patronage. They were known for their ribald humour, their satirical poetry, and their general disregard for social norms. They wrote songs that mocked the clergy, celebrated earthly pleasures, and challenged the authority of the established order. They were, in a sense, the medieval equivalent of countercultural rebels. Now, some might dismiss them as mere ne'er-do-wells, avoiding honest work and causing trouble. But their writings offer a valuable glimpse into the underbelly of medieval society, exposing the hypocrisy and corruption that thrive beneath the veneer of piety. Moreover, their willingness to challenge authority, to question accepted wisdom, played a crucial role in the intellectual ferment of the period. They helped to create a space for critical thinking and debate, which ultimately contributed to the intellectual and social transformations of the later Middle Ages. Yet, even in dire circumstances, we find evidence of resilience and resistance. The ostracized formed communities, supported one another, and found ways to create meaningful lives, despite the stigma and isolation they faced. They remind us that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can endure, and that even those who are cast out can find ways to build their own worlds, however circumscribed. Religious doctrine also played a crucial role. The Church, as the dominant moral authority, held immense power to define and enforce acceptable behavior. Heresy, the rejection of orthodox Christian belief, was considered not just a theological error, but a grave threat to the social order. Heretics were often subjected to public trials, excommunication, and even execution, serving as potent warnings against dissent. But it wasn't just the spectacular cases of heresy that mattered. The Church's teachings on morality, sexuality, and social roles permeated every aspect of life, shaping people's understanding of themselves and their place in the world. Those who deviated from these norms, whether through perceived sexual misconduct, challenging authority, or simply failing to conform to prescribed gender roles, risked ostracism and social exclusion. And then there were the social customs, those unwritten rules that often proved even more powerful than formal laws. Think about the stigma attached to certain occupations. Butchers, for example, often occupied a marginal social position, partly due to the association with death and blood, but also because their work was seen as polluting and distasteful. Similarly, those who engaged in activities considered morally suspect, such as moneylenders or prostitutes, were often relegated to the fringes of society. These stigmas, often deeply ingrained and rarely questioned, could have a profound impact on people's lives, limiting their opportunities and confining them to the margins. It's also crucial to remember that marginalization wasn't a monolithic experience. There was a spectrum, a sliding scale of otherness. Some individuals, like criminals, actively transgressed against societal norms, and their exclusion was often a deliberate consequence of their actions. Others, like those born with physical disabilities or suffering from mental illness, were marginalized by circumstance, victims of societal prejudice and ignorance. Still others, like religious minorities such as Jews or Muslims in Christian-dominated lands, were systematically excluded through discriminatory laws and practices. Distinguishing between these different forms of marginalization is essential for understanding the complexities of medieval society and the diverse experiences of those who lived on its fringes. And among those diverse experiences, few were as starkly defined, as irrevocably marked, as that of the leper. We've seen how legal codes mandated their segregation, compelling them to wear distinctive clothing and carry a bell or clapper. But the reality of that mandate, the daily impact of such an enforced identity, goes far beyond a legal clause. It was a tangible, audible declaration of separation, a constant reminder of their symbolic death within society. To truly comprehend the profound isolation and societal rejection inherent in this, we must consider the sensory reality of their enforced existence. Imagine, if you will, the tolling of a bell. Not the joyous peal from a church tower calling parishioners to prayer, but a smaller, more sombre sound. A handbell carried by a figure draped in coarse cloth, face perhaps obscured by a wide-brimmed hat or cowl. This is the sound, the image, that heralded the approach of a leper in medieval society. Leprosy was far more than just a medical ailment in the Middle Ages. It was a spiritual crisis, a visible manifestation of impurity in a world deeply concerned with sin and redemption. The theological interpretations of disease were unforgiving. Leprosy wasn't simply bad luck. It was seen by many as a divine judgment, a mark of God's displeasure branded upon the flesh. Some believed it was a punishment for personal sins, perhaps secret transgressions that festered within the soul and erupted onto the skin. Others saw it as a hereditary curse, a consequence of ancestral failings passed down through generations. This theological framework had devastating consequences for those afflicted. It justified, in the eyes of many, their legal and social banishment. Individuals diagnosed with leprosy were, in essence, declared legally dead. A formal ceremony, mimicking a funeral, would often be performed. They were stripped of their rights, their possessions, and their place within the community. No longer considered part of the body politic, they were cast out, forced to live on the margins, in isolated settlements known as lazarets. These lazarets, often located outside the walls of towns and cities, were meant to contain the disease, to prevent its spread to the healthy population. But they were also places of immense suffering and despair. Resources were often scarce, medical care rudimentary, and the sense of abandonment profound. The leper's bell and cloak, seemingly simple objects, were potent symbols of this profound otherness. The bell, a constant clang in the air, served as a warning to those who might inadvertently come too close. "Unclean! Unclean!" the leper was forced to proclaim, echoing the biblical injunctions. The cloak, typically made of coarse, undyed wool, further marked them as separate, as belonging to a different order of being. But the bell served another purpose as well. It was a plea for alms. Cut off from almost all means of supporting themselves, lepers were forced to rely on the charity of others. The bell, therefore, was not just a warning, but also a desperate call for compassion, a recognition that even in their outcast state they were still human beings in need. The symbolism surrounding the leper was carefully constructed to reinforce their exclusion. They were required to wear distinctive clothing, forbidden from entering certain spaces, and often denied basic social interaction. They were effectively erased from the map of everyday life, relegated to the shadows, their existence a constant reminder of the precariousness of health and the ever-present threat of divine judgment. And while the leper's plight represented an extreme, divinely sanctioned form of destitution, their forced reliance on the public's mercy placed them, in a fundamental sense, within the vast, complex, and often cruel landscape of medieval poverty. Their bell, a signal of both warning and need, resonated across a society where the lines between compassion and condemnation were constantly being drawn and redrawn. For the medieval world, poverty was not merely a material condition, it was a moral, social, and economic puzzle, and its sufferers were categorized with meticulous, if often brutal, distinction. But poverty itself was far from a monolithic experience. Medieval society, acutely aware of its hierarchical structures, also stratified its understanding of those in need. We find a crucial distinction drawn between the worthy poor and what were termed the idle poor. The worthy poor were often the elderly, the infirm, widows and orphans, those perceived as genuinely unable to provide for themselves. These individuals were often seen, crucially, as conduits for Christian charity, almost as living sacraments. Almsgiving to them was understood as a direct act of piety, a means of earning spiritual merit. Monasteries, wealthy landowners, and even ordinary townspeople regularly engaged in charitable giving, often through established almshouses or by distributing food directly to those in need. However, this benevolence did not extend to all. The idle poor, or vagrants, those capable of work but seemingly unwilling to engage in it, were viewed with suspicion and often outright hostility. They were seen as a threat to social order, potential criminals, and a drain on resources. This distinction fueled a complex and often contradictory approach to poverty. On the one hand, religious ideals emphasized humility and detachment from material possessions. On the other, practical concerns about maintaining social stability led to increasingly harsh measures against those deemed unproductive. And it's here that we begin to see the emergence of mendicancy and vagrancy laws. These laws, which varied from region to region and evolved over time, attempted to regulate the movement of the poor, often requiring them to remain in their place of birth or established residence. Begging was sometimes licensed, but often strictly controlled. Unauthorized begging could result in fines, imprisonment, or even expulsion from the community. The rationale behind these laws was a complex interplay of religious ideals and practical concerns. Officials and elites genuinely believed that limiting the movement of the poor would reduce crime, prevent the spread of disease, and ensure that those in need could be properly cared for within their own communities. At the same time, these laws served to reinforce the existing social hierarchy and to control a potentially volatile population. The daily life of the medieval poor was, in almost all respects, a desperate scramble for subsistence. Securing enough food to eat was a constant challenge. Malnutrition was widespread, and even in good years, many families struggled to obtain adequate nourishment. In times of famine, which were all too frequent, the situation became truly dire. People resorted to eating anything they could find, roots, berries, even grass. Shelter was another fundamental need that was often unmet. Many of the poor lived in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions, often sharing cramped dwellings with multiple families. Others were forced to sleep on the streets or in abandoned buildings, exposed to the elements. Even when work could be found, wages were typically low, barely enough to cover the cost of food and basic necessities. The chronic lack of resources, coupled with the constant threat of disease and violence, made life for the medieval poor a precarious and often short-lived existence. Yet, even as they sought to manage these aspects of human nature, to make life simpler for their subjects, the medieval authorities were keenly aware of a far more profound danger, any perceived deviation from established doctrine that could unravel the very fabric of their divinely ordered world. The fear wasn't merely of individual sin, but of a contagion of thought that could destabilize every facet of life. And that, in essence, is why heresy wasn't just a religious problem. It was a social and political earthquake waiting to happen. To understand the fear surrounding heresy, you need to grasp the medieval conception of order. God had established a divinely ordained hierarchy, with the church at its apex, acting as the intermediary between heaven and earth. To challenge the church's teachings was, in effect, to challenge God's authority, and by extension, to undermine the entire social fabric. Now, what constituted heresy could be surprisingly varied. It wasn't always about outright denial of core Christian tenets. Sometimes it was a matter of emphasizing different aspects of faith in ways the church deemed unacceptable. Perhaps a charismatic preacher started advocating for radical poverty, criticizing the wealth and corruption within the clergy, or maybe a group began reinterpreting scripture, offering alternative explanations that challenged established doctrines. Remember, the church saw itself as the sole legitimate interpreter of God's word. Anyone else offering their own versions was viewed with deep suspicion. The consequences of being labelled a heretic were catastrophic. The church wielded immense power, and it wasn't shy about using it to suppress dissent. This brings us to the infamous institution known as the Inquisition. The Inquisition wasn't a single, monolithic entity, but rather a series of tribunals established by the papacy to investigate and prosecute heresy. Their methods, shall we say, were not exactly gentle. The inquisitors operated under the assumption that those accused of heresy were already guilty, and their primary goal was to extract a confession. This was often achieved through a combination of psychological pressure, imprisonment, and yes, torture. The aim wasn't necessarily to kill the heretic, at least not initially. It was to force them to recant their beliefs, to publicly denounce their errors, and to be reconciled with the church. But what happened if someone refused to confess, or if they recanted but were later suspected of relapsing into heresy? Well, that's when things took a truly grim turn. Unrepentant heretics, or those deemed relapsed, were often handed over to the secular authorities to be punished. And the punishment, more often than not, was death. And it wasn't just any death, mind you. It was a public spectacle designed to serve as a stark warning to others. The most common form of execution for heretics was burning at the stake. Imagine the scene: a large crowd gathered in a town square, the condemned tied to a post surrounded by bundles of wood. The flames rise, consuming the body while the authorities read out the charges. This wasn't just about ending a life. It was about reaffirming the power of the church and the severity of challenging its authority. It was a very effective, if brutal, form of social control. It's easy to look back at these events with horror and disgust, and rightfully so. But it's important to remember the context. The medieval world was a place of deep religious faith, where heresy was seen as a grave threat to the very foundations of society. And the church, in its quest to maintain order and orthodoxy, was willing to go to extreme lengths to suppress any perceived deviation from the accepted norm. Yet, even as the church fiercely policed the boundaries of Christian belief, another distinct group lived within medieval European society, one whose very existence as an other posed a different kind of challenge to the vision of a homogeneous Christian world. The Jewish communities, often tolerated but rarely accepted, navigated a precarious existence shaped by theological distinctions and deep-seated prejudice. Excluded by law and custom from many traditional professions and land ownership, they were often pushed into specific economic roles that, ironically, only served to heighten the societal tensions already present. This economic role, while offering a degree of financial stability to some Jewish individuals, simultaneously fostered resentment and mistrust amongst the Christian populace. Usury, the lending of money at interest, was forbidden to Christians by canon law. This prohibition created a vacuum that Jewish communities, often excluded from land ownership and other professions, were pushed to fill. But the collection of interest was viewed as inherently immoral by many Christians, and this fueled anti-Semitic sentiment. A vicious cycle emerged. Jews were economically restricted, forced into money lending, resented for their role, and then further restricted as a result. This simmering resentment would frequently boil over into periods of intense persecution. Accusations of ritual murder, known as blood libel, were tragically common. These baseless claims, alleging that Jews murdered Christian children to use their blood in religious rituals, ignited waves of violence and pogroms. The expulsions of Jewish communities from England in 1290, from France on multiple occasions throughout the 14th century, and from Spain in 1492 are stark reminders of the precarious existence Jews faced. These weren't isolated incidents, they were part of a larger pattern of systemic discrimination and violence. The expulsions, devastating as they were, rarely offered a true escape. Often, those expelled simply migrated to other parts of Europe, seeking refuge only to face similar prejudices and restrictions. And even when not directly expelled, Jewish communities were often forcibly segregated into ghettos, walled-off sections of cities. These ghettos were not simply neighborhoods, they were physical manifestations of the social and religious separation imposed upon Jewish communities. Beyond the physical separation, visual markers further reinforced the divide. Throughout the medieval period, Jews were often required to wear distinctive garb, such as the Judenhut, a conical hat, or a yellow badge. These enforced markers served to visually identify Jews, making them easily identifiable targets for discrimination and violence. The very clothes one wore became a symbol of otherness, a constant reminder of their marginal status. This enforced visibility made it almost impossible to assimilate, to blend in, and to escape the pervasive prejudice. The lives of Jews in medieval Europe were thus marked by a constant negotiation between economic necessity, social isolation, and the ever-present threat of persecution. They were a perpetual foreign element, living within, but not truly belonging to Christian society. Their story is a complex and tragic one, a testament to the dangers of religious intolerance and the enduring power of prejudice. But the currents of marginalization and exclusion in medieval society ran deeper and wider than just religious identity. The same theological frameworks that cast some groups as outsiders also shaped perceptions of those whose physical or mental differences mark them as distinct. If being Jewish meant navigating a world of imposed roles and existential threat, looking sufficiently different could too. You might ask, what options were truly available to someone born with a physical impairment, or perhaps struggling with mental illness in the medieval world? Well, the answer is complicated and often disheartening. Medical understanding as we know it simply didn't exist. There wasn't a scientific basis for understanding conditions like cerebral palsy, epilepsy, or various forms of intellectual disability. Instead, these impairments were overwhelmingly interpreted through a theological lens. A child born with a clubfoot, for instance, might be seen as a trial sent by God to test the parent's faith, or, conversely, as punishment for some transgression, real or imagined, committed by the family. And then there was the truly terrifying possibility: demonic influence, a seizure, a period of catatonia, uncontrollable outbursts. These could all be seen as signs of possession, opening the door to truly horrific treatment at the hands of terrified and religiously motivated communities. But beyond these grim supernatural interpretations, what strategies did individuals and their families employ for survival? For those fortunate enough to have a supportive family, the responsibility fell squarely on their shoulders. While we romanticize the family structures of the medieval period, their tolerance for long-term dependence certainly had its limits. Families would often struggle to provide even the most basic necessities, let alone the specialized care someone with significant disabilities might require. For others, the only recourse was charity, both organized and informal. Monasteries and convents often provided alms to the poor and infirm, though these handouts were rarely enough to ensure a decent life. The streets of medieval towns and cities were filled with beggars, many of whom bore visible signs of their afflictions. It was a desperate existence, reliant on the generosity, or more often the indifference, of passers-by. Think for a moment about the sheer vulnerability of it all. And there was the spiritual dimension, the realm of folk beliefs and superstition. Medieval people often held contradictory views towards those with disabilities. On the one hand, there was fear and revulsion, fueled by ignorance and the belief that deformities were a sign of God's displeasure. On the other hand, there was sometimes a grudging pity, and even, in rare cases, a kind of reverence. Some believed that those touched by misfortune were closer to God, or possessed some sort of special insight. Individuals with dwarfism, for example, might be employed as court jesters or entertainers, their physical differences both exploited and, in a twisted way, valued. There are even scattered accounts of people with mental illnesses being consulted as oracles, believed to be channels for divine messages. It's a jarring contradiction, isn't it? This mixture of fear, pity, and occasional reverence. It underscores the precarious and unpredictable nature of life for the physically and mentally disabled in the medieval world. Ultimately, the precarious and unpredictable nature of life for the physically and mentally disabled in the medieval world was but one stark illustration of a society perpetually wary of difference, quick to judge, and often brutal in its enforcement of order. When divine displeasure or demonic influence was suspected, the community's response could manifest in horrifying public spectacles, designed to purge the perceived impurity and restore balance. But these were not the only instances of medieval justice making a terrifyingly public and often arbitrary statement. For those who broke society's laws or merely challenged the authority of its lords and kings, the system had another, equally absolute method of exclusion. The fear of divine wrath was mirrored by the fear of earthly retribution, and the displays of this retribution could be equally theatrical, ensuring that all understood the consequences of stepping outside the accepted bounds. Beyond these judgments lay a more complex reality, the world of the outlaw. The term itself, outlaw, literally meant someone outside the law, someone denied its protection, and subject to summary justice, usually death if caught. But who became an outlaw, and what did it mean to live outside the pale of justice in the medieval world? It wasn't simply a matter of being a hardened criminal, though certainly many were. Becoming an outlaw could be the result of a variety of transgressions, from petty theft, stealing a loaf of bread to feed a family, for instance, to more serious crimes like murder or treason. Sometimes it was a matter of refusing to submit to the king's court, opting to flee, rather than face what they perceived as an unjust trial. Other times, individuals were unjustly declared outlaws by corrupt officials or powerful landowners seeking to settle scores. So, the line between criminal and victim could often be quite blurry. Life as an outlaw was understandably precarious. They were fair game for anyone. Officially, anyone could kill an outlaw without fear of prosecution. In reality, of course, it was more complicated. While the law may have turned its back on them, outlaws often found refuge and support within the very communities they were supposedly preying upon. Villagers, sympathetic to their plight or fearful of reprisal, might offer them food, shelter, and information. This created a kind of shadow economy and social network, operating in the fringes of the established order. Think of the Robin Hood legends, for instance. While highly romanticized, they touch on certain realities of outlaw life, the idea of resistance against unjust authority, the reliance on the forest as a sanctuary, and the support of the common people. The forest, in particular, served as a crucial refuge. Vast and untamed, it provided cover, food, and a degree of autonomy for those fleeing the law. It became a liminal space, a place where the rules of society held less sway. Outlaw gangs, often led by charismatic figures, emerged in these spaces. Some were truly brutal, preying on travellers and terrorising villages. Others, like the mythical Robin Hood, supposedly redistributed wealth and challenged the power of the nobility. But regardless of their motivations, these gangs represented a challenge to the established order, a reminder that the king's authority did not extend to every corner of the realm. They were a constant source of anxiety for those in power, a symbol of social unrest, simmering beneath the surface of medieval society. Ultimately, the outlaw's life provides us a glimpse into the fragility of medieval justice and the complex relationship between law, order, and social rebellion. Yet, the raw, often violent defiance of the outlaw was but one manifestation of resistance against the medieval establishment. Not all who stood outside the mainstream did so by choice or by explicit armed revolt. Many were pushed to the margins by disease, social mores, or economic necessity, finding themselves branded by society, yet still finding ways to assert their agency and forge communities outside the norm. Resistance wasn't always about open revolt, of course. For many, It was a quiet, persistent refusal to be fully defined by the labels imposed upon them. Think of the lepers, segregated in their leprosariums. While certainly isolated, these communities often developed their own internal structures, their own systems of support and governance. They elected their own leaders, managed their own resources, and created a unique cultural identity, a leper culture, if you will. Within these enclosed worlds, individuals could find a sense of belonging and purpose that was denied to them in wider society. They weren't just victims of disease, they were active participants in shaping their own destinies, albeit within severely circumscribed boundaries. Then there were the subtle acts of defiance. The peasant who subtly underperformed their feudal duties, the vagrant who cleverly evaded the authorities, the heretic who whispered dissenting opinions in secret gatherings. These may seem like small acts, but they represented a consistent erosion of the established order, a quiet assertion of individual agency in the face of overwhelming power. And what about legacy? How do these hidden lives resonate through the centuries? It's about recognizing the shared humanity that connects us to those who were once relegated to the margins of society. It's about understanding that even in the darkest of times, people found ways to resist, to create community, and to leave their mark on the world. And it's about recognizing that their stories are an integral part of our own. They remind us that agency, community, and identity often flourish in the liminal spaces outside institutions. But these informal networks and alternative practices, while offering solace and resilience to those within them, often invited suspicion from those outside. What some saw as a quiet assertion of autonomy, others began to perceive as a dangerous challenge to established order, or even worse, a channel for malevolent forces. The very communities that provided internal governance and mutual aid, or the subtle acts of defiance that eroded established power, all represented forms of existence and action operating outside dominant societal control. And as the boundaries of orthodoxy tightened and fear of the unknown intensified, these alternative ways of navigating the world, especially those rooted in the everyday practices of the common folk, could be reinterpreted with devastating consequences. This brings us to a practice that still instills fear in many today, the practice of magic. The move from folk magic to diabolism wasn't a light switch. It was a slow burn, fueled by shifting theological landscapes and burgeoning social anxieties. For centuries, rural communities had relied on local healers, wise women and cunning folk. Their skills, passed down through generations, involved herbal remedies, charms and rituals designed to protect against misfortune, cure ailments, or ensure a bountiful harvest. These practices were deeply embedded in the rhythms of rural life, often coexisting, somewhat uneasily, with established Christian beliefs. But as the Church consolidated its power and refined its doctrines, a growing suspicion began to fall upon these traditional practices. What had once been seen as simple folk remedies were increasingly viewed through the lens of potentially demonic influence. The concept of maleficium, or harmful magic, gained traction. If someone fell ill, if crops failed, if livestock died, the temptation arose to blame it on a neighbour's malevolent spell. This suspicion was amplified by the elite's developing understanding of demonic pacts. Theologians and demonologists, drawing on classical texts and evolving Christian doctrine, began to elaborate on the idea that some individuals actively sought power from the devil in exchange for their souls. These pacts, they believed, granted the witch or sorcerer the ability to perform extraordinary feats, but also bound them to eternal damnation. The Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, published in the late 15th century, became a notorious example of this escalating fear, codifying the perceived characteristics of witches and providing guidelines for their prosecution. Once suspicion turned to accusation, the legal and social machinery of persecution swung into action. Local courts, often influenced by religious authorities, began to investigate allegations of witchcraft. Accusations could stem from personal vendettas, property disputes, or simply the misfortune of being different or perceived as a threat to social stability. Evidence was often flimsy, relying on hearsay, rumours, and confessions extracted under torture. The ordeal, a trial by fire or water, was sometimes used to determine guilt or innocence, a practice ostensibly justified by the belief that God would intervene on behalf of the innocent. The accused faced an uphill battle, often lacking legal representation and facing a hostile community already convinced of their guilt. Now, it's crucial to acknowledge a deeply disturbing trend: the disproportionate targeting of women. While men were occasionally accused of witchcraft, particularly in certain regions and periods, the vast majority of those persecuted were women. Why? Several factors contributed to this gendered vulnerability. One was the prevailing misogyny of the time. Women were often seen as inherently weaker, both physically and spiritually, making them more susceptible to the devil's temptations. Their knowledge of herbal remedies and childbirth, often passed down through generations, was viewed with suspicion, particularly if they operated outside the control of male medical professionals. Widows and older unmarried women were especially vulnerable, as they often lacked the social and economic support of a male protector, making them easy targets for accusation and blame. Another target was foreigners, which could lead to dangerous clashes in tight communities. Consider clothing. The foreigner's garments, perhaps tailored in a completely different style from fabrics unfamiliar to the local weavers, marked him immediately as different. Food habits, too, were a source of constant fascination and often disgust. The spices he used, the meats he consumed, the ways he prepared his meals, all were subject to scrutiny and judgment. These seemingly minor differences played a significant role in constructing and maintaining the boundaries between us and them. And then there's the law. Most medieval legal systems had specific statutes regarding aliens, those not born within the realm. These laws, often referred to as laws of alienage, varied considerably from place to place. Some offered certain protections, the right to conduct business, for instance, or to inherit property under specific circumstances. But these rights were often limited, conditional, and subject to the whims of local authorities. In many cases, foreigners were denied basic legal protections afforded to native residents. They might be subject to higher taxes, restricted from owning land outright, or even denied the right to a fair trial. And in times of crisis, war, famine, plague, they were often the first to be targeted, scapegoated for the community's woes. Think of the pogroms against Jewish communities throughout Europe. While those events targeted a specific religious and ethnic group, they illustrate a broader principle: the precarious position of anyone perceived as other during times of societal stress. The laws designed to protect aliens in times of plenty were often discarded when resources became scarce and anxieties rose. Their hidden lives were often lived on a knife edge, always aware of their tenuous place within the social order. For example, the foreign merchant, for all his perceived strangeness, at least had a place, a purpose, however grudgingly acknowledged. But what of those whose very existence was considered an anomaly, a breach of social and divine order, from the moment they drew their first breath? What of those who carried not the mark of a distant land, but the indelible, internal stigma of their own origins, navigating a life already carrying the weight of societal disapproval? To be born outside the bonds of matrimony in the medieval world was to be branded almost from the cradle. We use the term illegitimate, and it's a stark, clinical word, but it doesn't quite capture the pervasive shame, the moral judgment that clung to these children and often to their mothers. It wasn't merely a legal status. It was a profound stain on one's character, perceived as a tangible manifestation of sin. The Church, wielding immense influence over daily life, consistently preached the sanctity of marriage and the condemnation of extramarital relations. This dogma permeated every level of society, shaping attitudes towards children born outside that sacred union. They were frequently viewed as living embodiments of transgression, their existence a constant reminder of a parental failing. This stigma played out in countless ways, colouring interactions, limiting opportunities, and casting a long shadow over their entire lives. And the legal ramifications were often devastating. Inheritance, the cornerstone of social mobility and economic security, was typically denied to illegitimate children. Property, titles, even a family name, all these were usually out of reach. In a world where lineage and bloodline dictated one's position, to be born without a legitimate claim to either was to be relegated to the margins. A son might demonstrate loyalty, brilliance, even martial prowess, but if he were born on the wrong side of the blanket, so to speak, his path to advancement was often irrevocably blocked. So, what became of these children? Their fates were as varied as the circumstances of their births. Abandonment was a grim reality for many. Foundling hospitals and orphanages, often run by religious orders, became the last resort for infants whose mothers were unable or unwilling to care for them. These institutions, though providing a refuge of sorts, were often overcrowded and underfunded, offering a meagre existence at best. The mortality rates were tragically high, and the children who survived faced a life of hard labour and limited prospects. However, not all illegitimate children were condemned to such a desperate fate. In some cases, particularly among the nobility, a father might acknowledge his offspring, providing them with some form of support, perhaps even a position within the household. These children might serve as pages, squires, or even be trained in specific trades. While they still lacked the full rights of legitimate heirs, their lives were undoubtedly more secure and comfortable than those abandoned to the mercy of the streets. We also see examples, albeit rare, of illegitimate children rising to positions of prominence. Strong personalities, exceptional abilities, or perhaps a father's enduring affection could occasionally overcome the stigma of birth. But these stories are the exception, not the rule. For the vast majority, illegitimacy remained a significant barrier, shaping their destinies and limiting their opportunities in a society rigidly structured by blood and birthright. The struggle for acceptance, for a place within the very society that deemed them outcasts, was a constant, often losing battle. X. Think of the women who, through circumstance or choice, found themselves outside the prescribed roles of wife and mother. We're talking, of course, about widows and unmarried women, arguably two of the most vulnerable, yet potentially surprisingly resilient, groups in medieval society. For a widow, the death of her husband often meant a sudden and precipitous drop into insecurity. While idealized imagery might suggest a period of respectful mourning followed by comfortable inheritance, the reality was frequently far more harsh. Upon the death of her husband, a widow lost her legal and social protection. She was no longer under the aegis of a man. The legal challenges she faced in retaining property could be daunting. Relatives, both hers and her deceased husband's, might lay claim to lands and possessions. Guild regulations might prevent her from continuing his trade. The weight of managing a household, raising children, and potentially running a business fell squarely on her shoulders, and all this without the social and legal power she once held. And unmarried women? They faced a different, but equally challenging set of constraints. The spinster, as she would later be known, occupied an ambiguous space. Without the societal sanction of marriage, she was seen as incomplete, a threat to the established social order. Pressure to enter a convent was immense. This wasn't always a negative choice, of course. Convents offered education, community, and a degree of autonomy unavailable elsewhere. But it was still a choice often made out of necessity rather than genuine religious calling. The other option was to live under the guardianship of male relatives. Again, the level of care and control varied wildly depending on the family. Some might be supportive, others controlling and even abusive. The fundamental issue remained. An unmarried woman, past a certain age, was seen as a problem to be solved. Yet, nestled within these constraints, we find glimpses of remarkable agency. There were instances, rare though they may have been, where women managed to carve out independent lives. We find records of widows successfully running estates, navigating legal disputes, and even expanding their husbands' businesses. Unmarried women, sometimes through inheritance or shrewd business acumen, managed to acquire property and engage in trade. These women were anomalies, outliers in a society that sought to categorize and control them, but their existence demonstrates a capacity for resilience and independence that often goes unacknowledged. It's important to note, however, that even these successful independent women remained subject to scrutiny and suspicion. Their actions were judged more harshly than those of men. Their motives were questioned. Their very existence challenged the patriarchal structure of medieval society. The accusation of witchcraft, for instance, was more readily levelled against women who lived outside the conventional norms. These women, in defying expectations, were seen as inherently dangerous, capable of disrupting the natural order. Their autonomy was always precarious, a tightrope walk between independence and social ostracization. But social ostracization, though devastating, was not the most absolute form of exclusion medieval society could mete out. For those whose independence, whether by design or defiance, truly threatened the existing power structures, particularly the overarching spiritual authority of the Church, the stakes were infinitely higher. The accusation of witchcraft, for instance, mentioned earlier, could lead to death. Yes, but even that often presupposed a spiritual judgment. Yet there was one punishment, one ultimate severing, that eclipsed all others in its terror and its scope. It was a judgment passed down by God's representatives on earth, a sentence that promised not just temporal isolation, but eternal damnation. This was the threat lurking behind every challenge to ecclesiastical authority, every deviation from society's prescribed religious path. This was the ultimate condemnation, a spiritual death while still breathing, and its implications were profound, reaching into every corner of a person's existence. We speak here of excommunication. At its heart, excommunication was a spiritual death sentence. The Church, remember, held immense power in the medieval world, not just spiritually but also socially and politically. Being excommunicated meant being severed from the very source of grace, cut off from the sacraments, baptism, confession, communion, marriage, last rites. Think about that for a moment. Imagine being denied the very rituals that were believed to guarantee salvation. The Church believed and preached relentlessly that outside of it there was no salvation. So, excommunication wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It was a declaration that your soul was in grave danger. It was, in their eyes, a one-way ticket to hell unless you repented and were absolved. But the consequences extended far beyond the purely spiritual. This wasn't just about your standing with God. It was about your standing with everyone else too. Medieval society was deeply intertwined with the Church. Your community, your family, your livelihood, all were connected in some way to the religious fabric of the time. Excommunication brought with it a cascade of temporal consequences. You were, in essence, made an outcast. People were often forbidden from associating with you. They couldn't eat with you, trade with you, or even offer you shelter. Imagine the isolation, the sheer practical difficulties of simply surviving in a world that had suddenly turned its back on you. Legally, you could face disabilities as well. Depending on the severity of the excommunication and the local laws, you might be unable to hold public office, testify in court, or even inherit property. You became, in the eyes of the law, a non-person, your rights and privileges stripped away. For rulers, excommunication was particularly devastating. Their subjects were often released from their oaths of fealty, meaning they no longer had to obey the king or lord who was under the Church's ban. This could lead to widespread rebellion, political instability, and even the overthrow of the ruler. It was a potent weapon in the Church's arsenal, and they weren't afraid to use it. Now, faced with these daunting consequences, the excommunicated had essentially two choices: reconcile or resist. Seeking absolution meant acknowledging your wrongdoings, humbling yourself before the Church, and performing whatever penance was required. This could involve anything from fasting and prayer to public acts of contrition, even pilgrimage. The goal was to demonstrate genuine remorse and convince the Church that you were worthy of being readmitted into the fold. But what if you believed the excommunication was unjust? What if you were wrongly accused, or simply unwilling to submit to the Church's authority? Then the path of resistance lay open, a path fraught with peril. To defy the Church was to defy God, at least according to the prevailing worldview. But some individuals, driven by conviction or desperation, chose to endure a life outside the spiritual and temporal order, clinging to their beliefs, challenging the Church's authority, and carving out a precarious existence on the margins of society. But for millions across medieval Europe, the precariousness wasn't a choice, nor even a consequence of defying a powerful institution. It was the very bedrock of their inherited status. Their marginalization wasn't spiritual, but economic and legal, a condition woven into the fabric of daily life, where freedom was a distant dream, and their connection to the earth was as much a burden as a blessing. This was the condition of the serf, a person whose life was very circumscribed in some ways. While technically not property in the same way as a chattel slave, the serf was inextricably linked to the land. Their obligations were manifold. Primarily, they owed labour to their lord, working his fields a certain number of days each week. This varied from region to region, and lord to lord, of course, but it formed the bedrock of the feudal economy. Beyond this, there were often payments in kind, a portion of their harvest, livestock, or even handmade goods, all funneling wealth upwards. Their obligations were manifold. Primarily, they owed labour to their lord, working his fields a certain number of days each week. This varied from region to region, and lord to lord, of course, but it formed the bedrock of the feudal economy. Beyond this, there were often payments in kind, a portion of their harvest, livestock, or even handmade goods, all funneling wealth upwards. The legal distinction between a free peasant and a serf was crucial. A free peasant owned his land outright, or leased it with a fixed rent. He could, in theory, move freely and choose his own profession. The serf, however, was bound to the land. He could not leave without his lord's permission, and in many cases his children inherited this status. Think of it as a web of obligations, woven so tightly that escape was incredibly difficult. The lord in return was theoretically obligated to provide protection, but this was often a flimsy shield against violence and exploitation. Now, it's tempting to paint a picture of a purely binary system, free versus unfree, but reality is always more complex. Within serfdom, there were gradations. Some serfs held more land, enjoyed slightly lighter obligations, or possessed skills that granted them a modicum of leverage. And the line between serfdom and various forms of tenancy could become blurred, particularly as the medieval period progressed. While serfdom was the dominant form of unfree labour, it's crucial not to forget the continued existence of slavery, albeit on a smaller scale than in earlier periods, or indeed in other parts of the world at the time. The trade in slaves, particularly from Eastern Europe and regions bordering the Mediterranean, persisted. Captives taken in warfare often found themselves enslaved, forced to work in households, mines, or even as galley slaves on ships. These individuals had absolutely no legal rights. They were property, pure and simple. This is not to say, however, that those in unfree labour accepted their lot passively. Resistance simmered constantly. It could take many forms. Subtle acts of defiance, like sabotaging equipment or feigning illness, were commonplace. Flight was another option, though fraught with danger. A runaway serf risked capture and harsh punishment, but the possibility of finding freedom in a distant town, or a more lenient manner, was a powerful lure. And of course, there were larger, more dramatic expressions of resistance, outright rebellions, peasant uprisings fueled by economic hardship and resentment of the ruling class, punctuated medieval history. While often brutally suppressed, these revolts served as a stark reminder of the inherent instability of a system built on exploitation. These acts, large and small, speak to the resilience and the enduring hope for a better life that burned even within the most oppressed. But the struggle for a better life didn't end with a loosening of the chains, or indeed by never having been shackled to the land at all. For those medieval individuals who, for whatever reason, found themselves untethered from the stable structures of the feudal system, the artisan moving between towns, the pilgrim on their journey, or perhaps most profoundly, the wandering entertainer, a different kind of precarity emerged. Their very mobility, a freedom denied to the serf, became its own burden, fostering suspicion rather than security. It cast them into a liminal space, neither fully part of the established order nor entirely outside its reach, subject to a different set of scrutinies and controls. And this, perhaps, is where the tightrope walk of the medieval performer becomes most precarious. On one hand, their lives were in many ways dictated by the very bottom rungs of the social ladder. The perception of them was often one of itinerancy, unreliability, sometimes even outright moral bankruptcy. After all, these were individuals often untethered to the land, lacking fixed residences, and seemingly flitting from village to village at whim. This lack of stability of a defined place within the feudal order bred suspicion. Who were they, these wandering souls? Where did their loyalties lie? Were they carriers of seditious rumours, spreading discontent amongst the peasantry? Were they merely skilled beggars in disguise? On one hand, their lives were, in many ways, dictated by the very bottom rungs of the social ladder. The perception of them was often one of itinerancy, unreliability, sometimes even outright moral bankruptcy. After all, these were individuals often untethered to the land, lacking fixed residences, and seemingly flitting from village to village at whim. This lack of stability, of a defined place within the feudal order, bred suspicion. Who were they, these wandering souls? Where did their loyalties lie? Were they carriers of seditious rumours, spreading discontent amongst the peasantry? Were they merely skilled beggars in disguise? Such questions fueled a deep-seated anxiety within the authorities, both secular and ecclesiastical. One finds repeated instances of regulatory measures aimed at controlling these masterless men. Laws were enacted restricting their movements, requiring licenses and even outright banning performances in certain areas. Think of the Statute of Labourers in England, ostensibly designed to address the labour shortage after the Black Death, but also a powerful tool for controlling the mobility of the lower classes, a tool that could easily be and was applied to wandering minstrels. Performers were often lumped together with vagrants and beggars in legal codes, facing similar punishments for their perceived idleness and lack of contribution to the common good. Yet, and this is the crucial paradox, these very same individuals were also vital arteries of cultural exchange. Before the printing press, before widespread literacy, performers were the primary disseminators of news, stories, and music. They were living, breathing newspapers, carrying tales of distant lands, heroic deeds, and royal pronouncements. Their songs preserved histories, moral lessons, and communal identities. The epic poem, the bawdy ballad, the miracle play, these were not static texts gathering dust on a shelf, but vibrant, living art forms brought to life by the skill and charisma of the performer. They provided entertainment, certainly, but also education, social commentary, and a vital sense of connection to the wider world. So, we see this constant tension, the social condemnation versus the undeniable cultural contribution. The church might preach against the lewdness of a particular play, the Lord might complain about the disruptive nature of a travelling troupe, yet both would likely find themselves captivated by the very same performance. They understood, perhaps begrudgingly, that these entertainers were not merely frivolous distractions, but essential components of the medieval social fabric. The news they carried, the stories they told, the music they played, these things held power, the power to inform, to inspire, to unite, and even to subvert. This is precisely why the authorities sought to control them, to channel their influence, to ensure that their performances reinforced the existing power structures rather than undermining them. The minstrel, the actor, the performer. They were figures of both fascination and fear, forever walking that treacherous tightrope between acceptance and exclusion. This constant tension between utility and suspicion, between integration and marginalization, defined many peripheral roles in medieval society. But for some, the tightrope collapsed entirely, plunging them into an ostracization far deeper and more absolute than any performer could ever know. Their exclusion wasn't a calculated measure to control influence, but a visceral reaction to a perceived threat that transcended social order or moral judgment. For these individuals, existence was defined not by a precarious walk, but by an irreversible fall into the abyss of communal dread, a descent often marked by visible signs of suffering and a profound fear of contamination. The other became not just problematic, but an existential danger, a status epitomized by the fate of those afflicted with diseases that inspired both horror and profound moral condemnation. If leprosy inspired revulsion and slow, agonizing decay, it was the plague that brought about a swift and terrifying social collapse. The Black Death and subsequent outbreaks represent a watershed moment in understanding medieval outcast status. It wasn't just about individual transgression or physical difference anymore. It was about the terrifying potential for mass contagion. Imagine, if you will, living in a densely populated medieval town. Sanitation is rudimentary, knowledge of disease transmission practically non-existent. Suddenly people start falling ill. Black boils appear, fevers rage, and death comes swiftly. The sheer scale of the Black Death, wiping out perhaps half of Europe's population, created a climate of unprecedented fear. This fear, understandably, morphed into a primal instinct for self-preservation. Suddenly, your neighbour, your friend, even a family member displaying the telltale signs, was not just a person in need of comfort, but a potential vector of death. The healthy turned against the sick with a speed and ferocity that shocked even contemporaries. We see this reflected in countless chronicles and accounts. People fled their homes, abandoning their families, desperately trying to escape the invisible enemy. This led to immediate and brutal banishment. A person suspected of having the plague was often forced out of their home, driven away from the village, left to wander the countryside, often to die alone and unmourned. There was no gradual ostracization. It was an immediate expulsion, a severing of all ties. This highlights a critical point. The plague blurred the lines between the sick and the sinful. Disease, in the medieval mind, was often seen as a punishment from God, a sign of moral failing, either of the individual or the community as a whole. So, to be afflicted with the plague was not just to be sick, it was to be marked by divine displeasure, to be deserving of isolation and even death. The truly devastating effect of the plague was the breakdown of social order. Traditional systems of charity and communal support crumbled under the weight of mass death and widespread panic. Guilds, often responsible for caring for their members, found themselves overwhelmed. Religious orders, historically providers of aid to the poor and sick, were decimated by the disease. The very foundations of medieval society, built upon a sense of community and reciprocal obligation, began to crack. The plague intensified existing inequalities, pushing the already marginalized even further to the margins. If you were poor, if you were elderly, if you were disabled, your chances of surviving an outbreak were significantly lower. And if you succumbed to the disease, your chances of receiving even the most basic care were virtually non-existent. In short, the plague transformed the social landscape, creating new categories of outcasts and solidifying the position of those already on the periphery. While the Black Death starkly illuminated the fragility of social bonds and created terrifyingly immediate forms of ostracism, it also cast a harsh light on the deeper, often interconnected vulnerabilities that had always shaped who was deemed an outcast. Medieval society's understanding of deviance and undesirability was rarely singular. Instead, it was a complex web where illness, poverty, and perceived moral failing frequently intertwined, deepening the chasm between the accepted and the rejected. The immediate, brutal banishment brought by plague was an extreme manifestation, but it underscored the pervasive reality that exclusion was rarely a simple matter. It's crucial to remember that these categories of exclusion were rarely isolated. Poverty, for example, often intersected with disability, making life exponentially harder for those already struggling. A blind beggar might face not only the difficulties of navigating a world not designed for them, but also the suspicion of being a malingerer, a fraud preying on the generosity of others. Leprosy, carrying with it both physical suffering and profound social stigma, could strip individuals of their property, their families, and their very identities. Yet despite the medieval mindset, steeped in religious interpretations of suffering as divine punishment, these individuals persisted and found ways to survive, and even build community with one another. By delving into the hidden lives of medieval outcasts and misfits, we gain invaluable insight into human resilience and the enduring nature of social relations. Their stories remind us that even in the darkest circumstances, people find ways to persist, adapt, and thrive. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this dive into medieval history, please hit that like button and subscribe for more fascinating stories of the people history often forgets. May your sleep be peaceful and all your days be bright. We'll see you in the next one.